Hello again. In this video, we're going to be covering lifecycle methods. Specifically, we will be covering componentDidMount. There are a few other lifecycle methods, but we're not going to care about that for now because it's important. The principle is explained. The rest of the lifecycle methods are similar in terms of implementation, and I'm sure you'll be able to figure that out by yourself. Okay. Let's go. This was the state of our previous code. We had an application that looked like so. It essentially shows the current date and time. It's 4:54 p.m. in Singapore, 23rd of December 2020. But there's a major problem. We see that the time does not update. It's still 4:54, but if I refresh, it says 4:54:49. So for the last 17 seconds, the time had not updated. As the end user, I'm not expected to constantly hit refresh on the browser. So we need a better method. In our previous attempt to make the application more sensible, we used the set interval function. But we saw that the time still would not update by itself. It would not update by itself because in the set interval function, we are doing a run render. And inside the run render function, we are using date element. Now, this particular component is generated once, and the same component is reused again and again and again. If the component is reused, the time remains the same, right? So what we need is a way for the state of date element to be refreshed every half a second or every 1 second, right? So how do we approach that? I don't know. Let's try. First, we're going to bring this render function out because quite clearly set interval isn't quite doing what we want it to do. We're going to get rid of this nonsense because this too isn't helping us get to a sensible application. And let's say we put set interval here. Now, run render no longer exists. What we want is render, right? This dot render. Let's make it happen. Let's say we run this function now. This dot render. This is an extra parentheses. We don't want that. Poof, this doesn't seem to work. You know why? Because this whole chunk is the class body. The class body is not meant for you to execute commands. The class body is meant for you to write definitions. For instance, lines 19 to 25 define the render function. Lines 10 to 15 define the constructor function. The class body is meant for definitions, not for actually invoking specific methods or functions, right? So what we want is a space for where functions can be invoked, right? How do we do that? Here's how we do that. A good place for you to invoke functions within your class is a lifecycle method. There's a lifecycle method called componentDidMount. This particular lifecycle method is called every time this particular element React component called date element gets rendered onto your DOM. When the component is rendered on your DOM, the method componentDidMount is called. When the method componentDidMount is called, you can run whatever functions you want to run. So for starters, we're going to do alert component has mounted. We save it, we refresh. It says component has mounted, and then we see it, right? Now, this looks like a good place for me to call the set interval function. So how about I do that? I'm going to do set interval this dot render, right? And hopefully this will cause the date to be updated. No, it's not updating. The seconds don't seem to change. We want the seconds to change, right? So how do we do that? The problem is this dot state dot today has been set in the constructor, line number 13, right? And the value does not change after that. A better approach is this dot set state date, so not date, it's today, equal to new date. Hopefully, given that we are changing the state every time the render function is called, we will now get a ticking clock. Ah, it says this can happen when a component repeatedly calls set state inside component will update or component did update. So it looks like this is not okay. We need to do something else. We should not be putting this inside the render function. So let's define a different function. Let's say tick for ticking clock and this dot set state. And instead of calling render, we're going to call tick, right? And we are setting an interval of 500 milliseconds. So every 500 milliseconds, this function will be called. Let's hope this works. Voila, it works. So that is the purpose of componentDidMount. componentDidMount is a good place to put a bunch of code that runs as soon as your component is mounted. You can put a whole lot of different kinds of code and componentDidMount. Other lifecycle methods. I'm not sure how many more lifecycle methods exist. Let's try. There seems to be componentDidCatch. And if we go to the definition, we might find, if you want to go into the definition, try command click, and you should be able to go into the definition. And there seems to be class component. And if I say component did catch, it says catches exceptions generated in descendant components. Unhandled exceptions will cause the entire tree to unmount. Sounds like a lot of technical jargon. I think it essentially means if there's an error, this particular function will be called. And that's the idea. The React.js is all about event-driven programming. And there are many events that are fired as your DOM is being rendered. There is an event called componentDidMount. There's an event that is fired when a component is mounted. And when that event is fired, this particular function is called. Similarly, if a component has unmounted, you get another event. And with that event, you can use component will unmount. Similarly, if a parent component is passing in props, there is a function, there's an event that is fired, and you can respond to that event by calling should component update. It will serve you well to make yourself very familiar with make yourself comfortable rather with reading source code like this, because it you don't have to necessarily go to the internet to find definitions, right? You can find definitions from the source code itself. Given that React.js is developed by a huge corporation like Facebook, they do have the resources to write clean code that is well documented. So the source code is actually a very good place for you to find definitions of various functions. And it turns out there are only 4 lifecycle methods that are still implemented, that are still recommended by Facebook. There seem to be lifecycle methods from the past. When I first started learning React, there was component will mount. We did use that in some aspects of our code. Facebook doesn't recommend that you use this anymore, hence its placement in deprecated lifecycle methods. That was a pretty long video, and hopefully you guys followed everything. And I'll catch you in the next video.